So what is brisk story time? Well, brisk means quick or exciting. Yeah, so it's an exciting, quick story time. Yeah, you ready? Well, here we go. And here's our story of the worm and the tennis ball. Once upon a time, there was a worm that lived in a garden. And as this worm briskly squirmed, wiggling its way in the garden, until the worm came upon a tennis ball that was sitting in the worm's way. So the worm thought, well, I'd like to get by this tennis ball. So the worm tried wiggling to the right, but the worm was not able to wiggle around the right. So the worm thought, well, maybe I'll wiggle to the left. So the worm wiggled to the left, but the worm couldn't get by on the left. So the worm came back and thought, well, I can always burrow under this tennis ball. And so the worm tried burrowing, but the ground was too hard for the worm to dig into the dirt and go under. So the worm sat and thought and took a deep breath and exhaled and thought, I do not know how to get around this tennis ball. And then a beautiful butterfly came and landed on top of the tennis ball and looked down at the worm and said, hey, little worm, what is the matter? And the worm looked up at the butterfly and said, well, I can't get by this tennis ball, and I'd really like to get onto the other side. And the butterfly said, well, did you try wiggling to the right? And the worm said, yes, I tried wiggling to the right, but I could not get by. And so the butterfly said, well, did you try wiggling to the left? And the worm said, yes, I tried to wiggle to the left, and I could not get by. The butterfly said, well, did you try wiggling underneath and digging a hole and burrowing under the tennis ball? And the worm said, yes, I tried digging down, but the dirt is just too hard for me to burrow under this tennis ball. So the butterfly thought, well, why don't you just flap your wings and fly like me over the tennis ball? And the butterfly showed the worm how to fly like a butterfly. And the worm looked up and said, well, I have no beautiful wings like you, butterfly. So I'm not able to fly over. So the butterfly thought for a moment and said, well, I've seen other things fly without wings. Have you ever seen a helicopter fly? The worm looked up and said, well, yes, I have seen a helicopter fly before. The butterfly said, well, why don't you use your tail like a helicopter and fly over the tennis ball? And the worm said, I've never flown before, and I don't think my tail propels like a helicopter. The butterfly said, well, have you ever tried? The worm said, well, no, I have never tried. And I guess you're right. I should try. So the worm started wiggling its bottom until it got the motion of a helicopter propeller, until it started propelling very quickly. And then the worm flew up and over the tennis ball and the butterfly on top of the tennis ball. And the worm then slowly came down on to the other side of the tennis ball and looked up and said, thank you so much, butterfly. I never knew I was able to fly. And then the butterfly looked down at the worm and said, see, it's such a fantastic thing to try. And the butterfly flew off. And then the worm looked to the left and saw a wall. And then the worm looked to the right and saw a wall. And the worm looked behind it and saw a wall. And of course, directly in front of the worm was still the tennis ball. And then the worm looked down at the ground and thought, yes, the dirt over here is too hard for me to burrow down. And the worm looked up to the sky and said, at least I still have an option. And the worm flew happily ever after. The end. Well, I hope you enjoyed the story of the worm and the tennis ball. Until next time, adventure on.